The effect of tonality, the effect of shifting key. Pop music can use keys. It's usually just a shift up half a tone.
Right. And that's the sort of cliche modulate. You're going. It's just four chords. But then, whoa! That was really artistic what you did there. And then if they're really excited, they get. Compose, use songwriters. The other interesting thing is that the more closer to the present day you get, the more songwriters you have on a given song. So if you look at a modern song, I have besides the Beatles, I have Believer by Imagine Dragons, which is 2017. Words and music by Daniel Reynolds, Wayne Serban, Ben McKee, Daniel Platzman, Justin Tranter, Matthias Larson, and Robin Fredrickson. So, and each of them is probably contributing about 1/1,000,000th of what Beethoven would put into a piece. So, because, well, I'll play you just a little bit of it. I'm not going to sing it though. Wow, that took 7 people to compose. Right, so you have one chord, another chord, a third chord, and you're back home. Oh, it's so brilliant. All right.
Oh my.
Where was I going with that?
The keys, modulation.
Right, yes.
And architecture.
Right.
Finally, architecture.
So in pop music, there isn't really architecture. There's 4 chords. I mean, you do, it does depend on tonality, the tonal center that I was talking about in the previous conference, but they stay very close to home. They don't, they don't go anywhere. It's just. In fact, there was an arrangement. I work in various jobs in public schools. Now, is that is that different English terminology? State schools, right? So I get sort of an insider's view into what the state schools are teaching in terms of music, and they have found that especially in choruses. So the chorus teachers have found that the best way to keep the students' attention is to have them sing music that they know, which means music from their lifetime, which means music from the last 10 years or so. But one of the teachers that I played for one time played a medley of pop songs, which was called 4 Chords, and all of the, 7 or 8 songs had exactly the same chords. It was the same, I forget what the chords are, I think it's maybe 1, 4, 2, 5, something like that. It's very simple chords, you just play the same thing over and over again, and something more or less melodic goes on top of it.
And every top 10 Billboard chart songs from the past 20 years all use the exact.
Right, exactly. So there's not really much substance in the pop music. But they are still going off of tonality. It's not the cat walking on the keyboard kind of thing. That even pop music wouldn't stoop that low. That's for the people who over-intellectualize it and think, oh well, melody. That's for old simple people that now or in the future we need. Oh, it's so profound. It's intellectual. No, it's not. But the pop music is still working off of the basic tonal system. Now you could say an infinity about the tonal system and how it sort of developed. But perhaps very briefly I'll just say, many of you, if not all of you, will know or have heard some Gregorian chant. that is not tonal, that is modal. So, for instance, in the modes, you can find them on the piano by starting not on C, the way you would for a major scale, and playing the white notes, but, for instance, on D, D is the Dorian mode, which corresponds to mode 1 in Gregorian chant, if any of you know it. So, but you will often flat the B, but it sounds kind of like D minor, but it has a C natural. So it doesn't have the same goal orienting of the tonal system. It's sort of more, when it resolves sort of sideways rather than with the strong sense of tension being resolved. That's more, it's in the more modern music. So, and then you can get the Phrygian mode by starting on E. And the Phrygian mode has a half step at the beginning. Whereas, I'm starting at the wrong end. If you start with C major, let's say, going back to the scale that is sort of the basic in modern music, in classical music. As you can see on the piano, there are alternating white notes and black notes in a certain pattern. You have a group of 2 black notes, a group of 3 black notes. How that developed is a long story, which I'm not entirely sure of. But the important thing is that this is how the scale developed and then was realized on the piano. So you skip certain black notes, skip a note, skip a note. Here is a half step, even though it's 2 white notes, because there's no black note in between. A whole step means 2 notes of any kind, whether it's black or white. Whole step, and then 1 more half step. So the C major scale turns into a major scale because you have half steps between E and F and B and C on the white notes in the right spot. Now if you want to reproduce that pattern, the pattern once more from the beginning is whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So it's whole, half, whole, half. If you start that on another key, for instance, let's say C sharp, up a half step, you can go whole, half, whole, half. And you obviously get a different proportion of black to white notes. And you can't get a major scale starting on any note except C without using the black notes, because you won't have the right proportion of half steps and whole steps if you do that. But anyway, so going back to the modes, you could go through and figure out the whole step, half step pattern, and that would be the same, and you could transpose it, but I don't happen to know it because I haven't done much with the modes. I just know the modes from chant, basically. But the Phrygian mode has a half step at the beginning, which is very interesting, gives it a sort of melancholy character. So there's actually something in classical music called a Phrygian cadence, which sounds like that, because it has that half step in the bass, which is the beginning of the Phrygian scale. Then you have, just finishing the modes, you have Lydian starting on F. So it's almost a major scale, but the the 4th scale degree is higher. And Beethoven actually wrote a very famous movement in his last period, in one of his late string quartets, called A Holy Song of Thanksgiving to the Godhead, after a recuperation from an illness. Beethoven had been ill, and he wrote, in the center of that A minor string quartet, he wrote a 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how slow you take it. But the main sections of it are in the Lydian mode, so it's sort of harkening back to the old church modes. He's deliberately going for a more religious, antiquated feel than the modern system of a major key, which would be with the B flat as the 4th step. And then the Mixolydian, you don't need to know any of this, but just so that starts on G. So again, almost a major scale, but not quite. So that was obviously first millennium, and then going into the second millennium. Now, in the 16th century, there's polyphony, which means multiple voices going at the same time instead of just the chant, which is one voice. Then they add different parts each having its own melodic material, but sounding together, and so creating harmony, meaning more than two or more notes at the same time. Then in the 16th century, you get people like Palestrina and Victoria, the great Catholic composers whose works are pretty much the backbone of what you would sing in your church choir, at least if you happen to be a traditional Catholic. If you're a modern Catholic, you'll sing On Eagle's Wings or something, which is not nearly as good. They are getting closer to the tonal system where you have that strong sense of direction and resolution, but it's not quite there yet. So I could pull up a piece of Palestrina, but I think better to get on to tonality. But it's sort of a halfway house in between the modes and tonality. It's not fully fledged tonality yet, but you have what's called cadences at the end, where you would have something like this, which sounds to our ears very final in a way that, Gregorian chant does sound final, but it's final in a different way. It doesn't have that strongly directed sense that we start getting in the 16th century. It becomes more pronounced as we go further forward. By the time we get to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, second half of the 18th century and going into the 19th, we're now fully in the tonal system, which is like, as I said this morning, perspective in the visual arts. So in the earlier art, you have the figures, but they don't have a common vanishing point where you pick a point on the horizon and all of the lines go towards that. And I think in the Renaissance, I'm by no means a visual art expert, but when they figured that out, it's something that you do figure out. It's not an invention. It's because we have two eyes. So when you look at things, the lines coming out of your eyes meet a point. So when visual artists figured out how to do this, they liked doing checked floors or tiled floors, so that, oh, look at this, these tiles go that way and these tiles go, and it's all making them converge on the vanishing point. It's a similar thing in tonality because there is one point where you need to get to resolve. Now, let's go back to the major scale. The first note of the C major scale is C. The keys and notes have letter names. For some reason, we normally start with C rather than A. That's another story, but we'll just go with me. And in tonality, there are chords or triads, meaning a three-note chord that goes on each scale degree. So the triad that goes with the first scale degree of C is this, which is the C major chord, and that's the chord, the home chord that you're going towards if you're in C major. Very briefly, without getting too much into it, there is a reason that it sounds like that and it sounds good, and it has to do with physics, actually, which I took a class called The Physics of Music and Sound in college, hoping to receive enlightenment on this, but sadly it was a lot of physics and not a whole lot of music. But basically, if you take any pitch, and in this case it's made by the string vibrating inside the piano, the string is vibrating not just along its whole length, but also in halves, in opposite phases, and then in thirds, and fourths and fifths, and I think it goes on infinitely, but obviously the more portions you divide the string into, the fainter that pitch becomes. But the way the proportions work out, the whole length of the string is the first note. Half the string is an octave higher. A third of the string is the fifth. The fourth of the string, which is half of the half, is twice as high as the first note. And then the fifth note, a fifth of the string, is the third of the chord. So our major chord of the tonal system is made by taking those first five partials, as they're called, of the vibrating string as they occur in nature, and putting them close to each other in one octave, as it's called. So the same part of the keyboard, let's say, if we're talking about piano. So this sound, the major chord, is based on something that naturally occurs, that God put into presumably God could have just had the string vibrate one way and that's it, and then there would have been no overtones, as they're called. So actually, there's a way to test this. I'm not sure whether it'll work on this piano, but let's try it. I'm going to play a low note very loudly. I want you to see if you can hear any other pitches besides the one that I'm playing as the note resonates. It won't be very loud. It'll be sort of like a faint echo or a hum or something. But let's see what we hear. Does anybody hear this note? Raise your hand if you do. Hear this note? It's very faint. Let's try again. This one, very faintly. My wife, she's just saying that. Well, anyway, if you did work it out, you can hear. It's not perfectly in tune, but. And then it keeps going, and obviously the intervals between the notes as you get higher will get smaller and smaller like that until they don't correspond to any specific notes. So it's not totally taken from nature, but the basic chord, it does occur in nature, and this is sort of a making explicit of what is implicit in the vibrating string, which I think is very interesting. Anyway, so then the system that has been built into builds a similar chord on each scale degree. So once more the scale. So we have C. You'll notice that sounds slightly different, not just because it's higher, but because it's a different proportion of half steps and whole steps in the chord. So this is a major chord, and this is a minor chord, because the first one, the distance between the bottom note and the middle note is larger. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps. And in the minor chord, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. So the minor chord is sort of a flipping of the major. If you want to keep the same bottom note, you just move the middle note down a half step, and you get C minor instead of C major. Now that doesn't occur in nature, right? Because you have the major chord is the one that occurs in nature. So making the chord minor is going to express conflict because it wants to go back here, which is what it is in nature. So this means there's something, it's more conducive to expressing conflict, angst, sadness, etc. And many, although not all, of Beethoven's most famous pieces are in minor keys, or at least begin in minor keys. The whole point of the Fifth Symphony, for instance, is that it starts in minor, but then makes its way to major, which means the conflict that was set up at the beginning has now not just been resolved from a foreign key home to C minor, but the source of conflict has been removed, and we've resolved it back to C major, which is where it's trying to get. So, right, we have, going back to the chords on the scale, C major, D minor, and you just take the notes that are in the scale. That's how you figure out whether it's major or minor. It's just whatever it happens to be. Minor, minor, major, major, minor, and a weird one that's diminished, which is not that there. That's another type of chord, but it's not as common. So those chords that you build on the different scale degrees are your building blocks in tonality. And the most important chords, obviously the one, we call the chords based on the scale degree they're based on. So this is the one chord, and you would use a Roman numeral 1 to describe that. And then the chord on the fifth scale degree, which is next most important. As you remember in the overtone series, you've got C. Your first note that's not a C is a G, which is a fifth above the C. C, D, E, F, G. So the chord based on the fifth scale degree is what's called the dominant, because it's very important. It's next most important after the tonic. Tonality is very hierarchical, as I was saying, in contrast to atonality, which is democratic, meaning that there's no sense of center or no sense of direction. And the commonest form of resolution in tonal music is going from the 5 chord, and you can hear where this wants to go. It wants to go there, right? And the next most important chord is the 4 chord, in this case, on the chord on F. And this is what's called the subdominant, meaning the underdominant. Not actually, because it's one note below G, but because it's the sort of the opposite of the dominant. The dominant is a fifth above the home note, the tonic. The dominant is a fifth below, so it's the dominant in the opposite direction. And that turns into a common chord progression: 1, 4, 5, 1. 1, 4, 5, 1, and then you're back home. Now, what I just played takes 5 seconds. Tonality, when applied to a whole musical structure, is basically the expansion of that brief progression throughout a whole movement. Obviously much more complicated. It's not like you stay on this chord for 5 minutes and then go to this chord after another 5 minutes. But that's what it basically is reducible to in terms of the overall basic picture of the harmony. So in sonata music, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, including to the end of Beethoven, actually including Brahms, who lived to the end of the 19th century and who was still writing in this old tonal sonata style. The normal first move away from your home key, because you do move away from your home key in sonata music, as opposed to the pop music, which just stays in the same key, changing the chords, but it still has its same center. If you want to move away from, if you want it to be an interesting piece of music, rather than a modern piece of music that doesn't go anywhere, you're going to go on a journey. You're not just going to stay at home all the time. You're going to leave your house and go somewhere else. The first step that is usually taken is going to the dominant. So let's say you start in C major and you're going to modulate to and get to not just the chord of G, but the key of G. So now you're in a different scale with the F sharp, which is not in the home key. It doesn't. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. It doesn't matter if you don't get all of it. Just the important thing is there is a home key, in this case C, and you go out of it, as I will show you from various spots after I finish this. So the first step is into the key of the dominant. So the dominant chord becomes its own key, and now you're not at home anymore. You're not in C major. You're in G major, and usually the first part of a sonata movement will end in the dominant, so it'll do something like this. And that's ending, it's cadencing, as the expression is, not in the home key, but in a related key. In this case, G major instead of C major. But the effect of that is, because you are raising one of the notes, instead of F natural, the white note, you have F sharp, the black note. That's creating tension. It's rising. It's rising both in pitch and it's rising in energy, because it requires more energy, for instance, to sing a higher note than to sing a lower note. So that move to the dominant early in the piece creates tension, and then the rest of the sonata movement is devoted to so that's what's called the exposition. I presume this was in the Coriolanus lecture, for those of you who were there, but I'll go over it again. So the main parts of sonata form, which is the main form that you have tonality expressed in Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. You have the exposition, the first part, which is where the composer gives you his main material and what he's going to be doing with it. And that's the part that moves out of the home key into another key. So that sets up tension. Then you have the development, so let's say you've left home and you're in a hotel. So now on the development, you leave the hotel, you go on the open road. You have no bearings. You go through many different places. And you develop, it can be material from the exposition, which is common, and it's the composer's choice, anything he wants. Or in some cases, there's a new theme, like in the Eroica first movement, in conjunction with many other developments of material from the first part. It's a huge piece. And then at the end of the development, the music comes back to the home key. The recapitulation always begins in the original key, in the home key. There are instances in both Haydn and Beethoven where they sort of play with you. where, for instance, they might start playing the first theme, the opening of the piece, but in the wrong key. And Haydn will sort of, did you notice something was wrong? And then he'll go and sort of think, oh, this is the right key. Okay, yes, good. And because the listeners, without having necessarily studied all this was just the music that was in their ear, and so they would know to listen for that. Which is something we have to sort of learn laboriously because we have all the post-sonata music in our ear, pop music and everything, so we need to learn again how to listen to the classical music, which is more complicated because people's attention spans were greater back then. So, broadly speaking, almost all the time, when you get back to the beginning of what's called the recapitulation, meaning going back to what's in the exposition, you'll not just go back to the first theme of the piece, but also to the home key of the piece. And the way you get there is by setting it up by means of its dominant. So in Beethoven, you often find that, well, Beethoven is the most well-known case. He'll build up a chord. Especially if you add a seventh to it, then it's this extra note here. Okay, if I stop there, is it completed?
No.
No, right, it needs that. And the longer you play that chord, resolve it. Okay, thank you. So, if you're listening for the dominant, I mean that's not something that you'll be able to do just right off the bat, but once you start sort of tuning into that way of listening, that's your signal that the recapitulation, or recap for short, is coming. And then you'll go back and do the first part, the exposition again. But there's a difference this time. And it has to do not with the themes, but with the harmony. So you may remember in the exposition, you moved out of the home key, right? So you start in the home key and go usually to the dominant, the 5 chord, the key of the 5 chord. So in this case, from C to G. Now in the recap, because you are removing the tension that was accumulated both in the exposition and the development, the composer keeps the whole set of material in the same key. So he doesn't change key this time, he keeps it all in C. And usually there is a second theme that goes with the second key, or it could be multiple themes that go with the second key. So in G major you'll have heard various themes in the exposition. In the recap, you'll hear those same things, but they'll be in C instead of G, which is, it's tying it together and it's resolving the harmonic tension created by leaving the key at the beginning. So this is like, you've left your house, you've gone to the hotel, you've gone on the road, now you're back home, and you're sort of settling in again instead of going out. You're staying put instead of going out. And then occasionally you might end the movement right with the end of the recapitulation. Sometimes there might be a coda, which means a tail, T-A-I-L, an ending piece. Especially in Beethoven and also in Haydn, though for different reasons, if the recapitulation in itself is not sufficient to sort of wrap up the narrative and the harmonic tension sufficiently, then there will be more. And that's another key point in Beethoven's structure, is often when he's ending the recapitulation and it's either you have a sense that it's complete or you have a sense that it's not complete. And if it's not complete, you'll sort of play with your expectations and think, oh, is it going to end? No, it's not, because there's all this further wrap-up that needs to be done. And so the basic of tonality and of sonata form is that you have a home key, and that's your center of gravity. That's where you in order for the tension to resolve, in order to be at home, you need to come back to that key. The music leaves the key, it goes into another key, often the dominant. Beethoven starts playing with that and going into other keys. The development is all over the place and can pass through many different keys. The recapitulation goes back to the original key and stays there instead of leaving. And that resolves the harmonic tension that was accumulated earlier in the movement. So tonality is basically large-scale harmonic structure. And that's what gives classical music, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and by extension Schubert, Brahms in the 19th century, its tremendous power, because it's a very highly organized and it's like it's telling you a story, but in in a very short space of time. A writer on music that I like very much, Donald Francis Tovey, who was about the same time as Constant Lambert, he says that a sonata form has the dramatic force of a novel, or but it takes place on the time scale of a short story. War and Peace, let's say, into 15 minutes. It's that kind of intense and a dramatic expression. Now, I think that's been enough talking. Perhaps I should illustrate it, unless there's not going to be a test on this, because it wouldn't be possible. But does anybody have any questions that immediately come to mind? No, I didn't think so. I hope that didn't all go over your head, but I think the basic idea is you have a home key, you move away from it, it creates tension, you go back to the home key, that resolves the tension. Now, perhaps we should do the... I forget. Your Excellency, did you have an example in mind? You want to do the Eroica? Or?
Yes, but it's not exactly that. It's not exactly the example of the recapitulation.
Right, no, it doesn't need to be that, yeah.
But it's an example of the recapitulation different from the exposition.
Ah.
With, that's the very beginning of the recapitulation.
Right. That is... I'm wondering whether it might be better to pick a simpler example.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Why don't... This is what we did with the Beethoven weekend several years ago. There's an early piano sonata of Beethoven's, which is very simple. He actually didn't mean for it to be published, but his brother decided that it was worth publishing, and he took it and had it published. So Beethoven, I'm sure, was horrified that it was published. He didn't want it to be published, but here it is, so we have it, and this is counted as the 20th of the 32 piano sonatas, even though it was written probably in between the 3rd and the 4th of the 32 in chronological order. So this is a relatively simple example of sonata form. And I think it's a short enough movement that I'll just play through it and call out the important parts as it goes.
Call that home or hotel.
Right,
That's
yes.
very clear.
Very good, okay. So our key is G major. So I was supposed to say this and I didn't. So on each of those 12 notes, there are 12 notes between this C and the C above it. 1, 2, 3, 4, counting black notes, of course. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then with 13 you're back to where you started. So each of those 12 notes, you can build the major chord and build all of those subsequent chords upon it. So, for instance, C sharp major or D flat major is the same thing. It's the same major key structure, it's just shifted up a note. But the different starting places give composers different colors, so to speak. So G major sounds different as your home key than C major does. And often, if you become very experienced in listening to it, you'll hear the different keys in their relation to C major, because C major is the sort of basic white note key, as it's called. So if you have a key with a lot of sharps, raised notes in it, that sounds very bright, it sounds higher. If you have a key with a lot of flats in it, lower notes, like, say, A flat, that's a darker key, quote unquote, because it has more lowered notes. So raised notes give you brighter, lowered notes give you darker. And G major is what's called a sharp key, meaning it has a sharp in the key signature, but only one, so it's quite close to C major. But it's, if I'm going to do 1, 4, 5, 1 in G, it's going to be this. Now C major is the 4 chord, D major is the 5 chord, and back to G as the 1. So that's your home base. Now let's see what happens. Going to the hotel. getting settled in the hotel. That's the end of the exposition. So now, that sounds like home, right? It's not this anymore. We've moved and we're now here. You couldn't end the piece there because it's not resolved. You're still in the hotel instead of at your home. But you've settled into the hotel. In other words, we've been in D major long enough that if I were to just... That's not an end. You can't do that because you're not there. It'll be like teleporting, which at least I can't do. Bilocation or any of that stuff. Right. So then, in most sonata movements, the composer calls for the exposition, that first part, to be repeated. And that is a good way of familiarizing the audience with what's going on, both in terms of the themes and in terms of the chord progression. And so I guess there you'd have to break the home-hotel analogy, because you do sort of teleport right back to the beginning, but then you instantly start the journey over again. That is a remnant from earlier pre-sonata music, like dance music, where you would have a small form that would maybe end its phrase, a short phrase, in the new key, and then go back and repeat it. Like a dance movement will often repeat its phrases. And it's been taken over to sonata when those smaller forms were expanded into the sonata form. And so sometimes you have varying opinions on whether the repeats should be left out, especially now that in modern times we know the music, or some people know the music. But I think in this case it's good to, it's short enough and it'll be useful to play it again to get a sense for it. So I'm going to just end the end of the exposition the way it would have sounded, and then go back and play the exposition again, so you get a second shot at it. So here is the end of the first time. Repeat. So this is the home key again. Hotel. Settled in the hotel. That's all the dominant preparation you get. You get one bar of warning, and you're home. In a larger piece, it could take a half a minute to a minute. But here, he's in E minor, up here. And he's actually emphasizing the dominant of E minor, which is the wrong key. So he's playing with that. Back to E minor. And this is sort of a pivot chord that gets you back to here, the home dominant. And we're home. Now listen for the part where it changed the first time, because it's going to be different. Because it's staying in the key. This is different. second theme at home instead of in the hotel. Hear how it sounds different? Same melody, it's in a different key. It's in the home key. You're getting resettled at home. The end, and you're home. So in this case, because it's a short, simple piece, and it doesn't go too far afield. In the development, it goes to D minor, then to A minor, then to E minor, but that's it. And then you're back home. In some of his later pieces, like the Eroica, he basically goes through almost every key. And in that case, you can't just go, you're home again. We need to time in proportion to how much out of the key stuff you had earlier, and then you go 5, 1, then you're home. Whereas in a simple, short, relatively non-angsty movement like this, you can afford to just do we're home. And there's no coda either. There's no extra ending piece because the development was short. There's not a whole lot of tension that's been accumulated. So if you get to the end of the exposition, but in the home key, you just add 2 extra, or you space the chords slightly differently. At the end of the exposition, it was this, which is not as final. Yum, bum, bum. At the end, you go. Further apart, and they're different chords. The first time they're the same chord. This time they're different chords. 5-1. So that cadence, those last 3 notes or chords, that's sort of a microcosm of the whole piece. You start in G, you move to D, and you go back to G. That's what you do at the very end here. You go G, D, G. So that's summing up in 3 chords what you just did in the whole 3 minutes. Does anybody have questions about that? Is this going entirely over your head?
You make me feel music.
Okay, good. Well, that's the important thing. If it gives you, this should be additional tools to help you understand what you're hearing. It should not be, oh well, now I need to listen for the tonic and the dominant. It's a way of describing to you what you are hearing. And the analysis depends upon the music and not the other way around. So, as I said, the people of the time that this was written, so say the 1790s or 1800s, they have this style in their ears. They just expect it to move out of the key and go back into the key. And they're not really, unless you're studying explicitly theoretical manuals, you're not thinking about it. So Beethoven just calls, when he says repeat the first part or repeat the second part. He doesn't say repeat the exposition, repeat the development. It's just the style that has been developed and that is commonly spoken. It's like a language that's spoken. You can speak a language without necessarily going into the verbs and nouns and the different parts of speech, although if you do know those parts of speech, you will have an improved knowledge of the language that you are speaking. You'll probably know how to speak it better. But you don't sort of go to, okay, now it's time for my noun, and then I need a verb. And then, right, so the technical description, if any of it goes over your head, that's fine. The important thing is that it's illustrating or explaining the musical processes. And the most fundamental of the musical process is that you have a home key, that's your center of gravity, your vanishing point, like perspective, your magnetic pole, you could also say. It's your home base. You move away from it, creates tension, and the rest of the piece after the first section is spent dissolving the tension and going back to it. But in the case of especially Beethoven's later works, that can get more and more complicated, because as we go past the French Revolution, things are not quite so simple as just resolving the conflict anymore, right? Because society is changing pretty drastically. So this is, again, not to say that Beethoven is, oh, well, the French terror, the terror just happened, a bunch of people got guillotined, so I better change the style I write music in. No, but that affects the way people experience life, and your experience of life goes into your music. So Beethoven is writing from a different place than Haydn was, who was born almost 40 years before him. In any case, you have the home key, you go away from it, you come back by a more or less circuitous route, depending.
John, notice the beginning of the recapitulation in the first one to the Eroica is very clear.
Yes.
Key moving.
Right.
I can't get the drums in the Home of the Hotel. I really can't.
Okay.
But that is a very good illustration for most ears
right.
of key change.
Yes. Well, here. To properly appreciate it, one needs to have heard the whole first part of the movement.
No, just the
right.
The
instant
the
of the
last bars of the exposition. That's the home key, which you just described. Then you're going to get the beginning of the recapitulation, which the end of the development is is it? No, it's not B flat.
Yes, the preparation on B flat. Yes.
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 And then it's going to shift into E flat, and then it swerves into D and F.
Right. So that's the more circuitous. Right.
That's a very. It's a very clear swerve.
Yes.
So this time you can really hear it. I can't hear Home and Hotel. But this you can really hear what is a key change.
Right.
At least it's good enough. It gets in my ear.
Okay.
You get it?
Yes.
You find it?
All right. So this is the end of the development, which has been all over the place. We're in E flat major, which means our dominant is going to be B flat. So when we start hearing B flat, this was the part I played just a little while ago, but here it is for real. It's just one note in the bass, B flat over and over again. B flat. There's a lot of tension built up by this point. Yeah, here we go. 5, 5, 1. First theme. Here it changes. New key. But it doesn't stay there. It changes again, and this balances the first strange key. But we need to get home. So here's the home dominant again. It builds up. And we're home. And then we're home for real. So the first time we went back, we think we're home. And it swerves.
What key is not now, John?
This is F major, so this is on the sharp side. You've risen. This is a whole step above the home key. So instead of E flat major, you're in F major. This is a bright key compared to the home key. So then to balance it, he modulates to D flat, which is one note below the home key. So we went from E flat up one to F major, and then without going back to E flat, he goes to the key one below it, D flat. So we hear the first theme in the key one step above, and then one step below. So it's sort of circling it. Are we going to stay here? No. Where is that? This is our home dominant on B flat.
even I can hear the key changes.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Yes, they're very. I think it helps when it's the same melody or the
Yes.
same figure, and then you can hear it as it goes. Or it's a little harder when it's just you're listening for the chords without having a melody on top of them, because the melody is the surface of the music. It's the going to hear it.
When Beethoven was young and he was accompanying some singer who was a little bit proud of herself, he was accompanying her and he began changing key until she was lost.
Yes.
Which is to say he knew how to modulate, and
Yes.
there's a lot of modulation in Beethoven,
Yes.
and it's architectural.
Right. Exactly. Can I give one more?
Please,
So,
John, please.
a couple of you have mentioned to me the Emperor Concerto, the fifth piano concerto by Beethoven. Now, there's a very interesting part at the end of the second movement. The second movement is in a rather remote key, as you would say. So a remote key is farther away. It's not so closely related to the home key as the dominant is. In this case, it's the same key as the Eroica, actually, E flat. And then the slow movement is here, which has one note in common on the piano anyway, E flat, but it's a very different sound from the... So by this point, Beethoven is already getting away to some extent from the traditional key relations. Haydn had actually done a lot with this, especially towards the end of his life, but he used it in a slightly different, or very different, expressive way than Beethoven did. So Beethoven has his slow movement in, he writes it as B major, but if you want to relate it to the home key, well, it doesn't matter. It's the same as C flat major, but it's easier to write B major than C flat major. That's in harmonic relations, we're not going to get into that. B major is not closely related to E flat major. So you have the whole movement in B. So this is your new home key. And it's basically, slow movements are generally much simpler structurally than the first movement. The first movement is when the audience is freshest. It can follow exposition, development, recapitulation. The slow movement is usually, if it is in sonata form, it often leaves out the development or has a very short development. So it basically says something, and then after a short interlude, it says it again with that slight harmonic tweak, but it's generally much easier to follow, and it's more lyrical, it's more restful, both in terms of the music and for the listener. So another common slow movement form is variations, where you have a theme or a melody, and you just vary the melody, either by decorating it or by composing a new melody, but on the same harmonic basis. In other words, you take a short section and vary it repeatedly. And that is basically what's going on in this movement. So the opening theme, which is just chords and the strings, and it comes back later in the movement in several different variations. So you have the piano, which it's the same chord progression, but he's decorated, added a tune on top of a melody. And then there are broken chords, so the chords spelled out one note by one note, while the orchestra, which I can't do at the same time, sings the main theme. So that's another variation. It keeps going, it sort of unwinds. So we're ending quite decisively in this new strange key, or the second movement as a whole has been in this new strange key. And it dies away. I think it's the horns that just hold that one note. And then it drops a half step. What's going to happen now? That happens to be the dominant of the home key. So this is kind of a sneaky way of getting home. It's like going in the back door. And then Beethoven sort of tentatively plays these chords, which turn out to be the third movement theme, except a lot louder and faster. But here he's sort of feeling his way out of the dreamlike atmosphere of the slow movement. wait a minute, I'm home. Yeah. And then you're into the third movement. So in his middle period, which this is from the second of his three sort of creative periods that you can divide his work into, he starts experimenting with running the different movements into each other. If you remember the sonata I played last night, the sonata Quasi una Fantasia, the different movements are all sort of run together. And here, it's the first movement stands alone, but the second goes into the third. The slow movement goes into the faster movement. And often in the middle period, like the fifth concerto, the violin concerto, there are other examples that I'm forgetting, but the Appassionata sonata, the slow movement has sort of the quality of a dream. It's static, it's not going anywhere. And usually, yes, in all three cases, that's because it's variation form. So he's taking a short phrase, a relatively short phrase, which has, this is more like the pop music, where it's not modulating, it's just, it's much better than the pop music, but it's simple. And it stays here. And if you're varying just those chords for the whole thing, it's not going to leave. You're still at home, or in this case, you're not in the home key, because this is a different key from the key we started the piece in. But so the harmonic stasis, it's not moving anywhere, has the effect of a dream. You're not going anywhere in your dream. It's just sort of an illusion or a happy memory or a thought, but it can't go anywhere. So how do you get out of that? Well, in Beethoven's case, you could just end it there. For those of you who know the piece, if he just ended it there, you can do it, but it's sort of, what's the point? He doesn't, it's actually not until the third period that he figures out, or that he starts writing variation movements that have an ending. And the way he does it is he starts off as if it's going to be another variation at the end, but then the doors open up and you actually do have a journey that goes through different keys. And that is it has a remarkable effect if you are listening for it and you know the difference between a variation movement that just stays in one key and his late variation movements, like in the string quartets or the last piano sonata, opus 111, also 109, the third to last, which is also a set of variations. And he goes through the variations, and instead of them just sort of staying, and then he breaks out of it like you suddenly wake up from a dream, instead he finds a way to finish it off and create a sense of journey, but within the variation form, or extending the variation form, which is very interesting. But anyway, so we're here, and we've basically just been there for the entire movement, with a couple exceptions. Things are never absolutely simple in Beethoven. Then you go to the home dominant, and there you go, and you're home. So that feature of blurring the two, or not blurring the two movements together, but blurring the transition, having them go from one into the other, that obviously it provides more continuity, and it's more of a narrative, right? Instead of just, here's a separate piece, and we finish there, and now we're going to do a different piece, which is, it could be, the movements of a sonata are always somehow related to each other, not necessarily, usually not in terms of the melodic material that is being used in them, but in terms of the general feel of them. And it's not something you can put your finger on and say, here's why this movement belongs in this piece and not in another movement in another piece in the same key. But in this case, Beethoven is going further and saying, the second movement is over, but the narrative is going to continue, and so we are going to continuously go into the third movement instead of movement as a separate thing.
Wow. Probably lunchtime is quite soon. Alan, what's the time?
12:15.
12:15. Well, that gives, I don't know what arrangements they have for lunch, but a quarter of an hour to get most of it together. But I think you've worked hard enough for the moment, John.
That's why I'm here. Does anybody have any questions on that before we
break off?
Rose, are you allowed to ask that?
Yeah.
I guess it's embarrassing that I don't actually know this.
No.
I mean, yeah, I don't know anything about music.
That's not true.
So you were mentioning the modes
Yes.
in the beginning. So if some, say, Benedictine monks from the 13th century got in a time machine and
Yes.
were listening to the
That bit.
recapitulation, would they be like, so we would say, oh, it's changing key here. Would they be hearing it in terms of modes, like we're going from a Lydian to?
Well, first of all, they'd be horrified. What is this horrible music, which is so, it's dramatic, it's earthly, it's not. They're used to Gregorian chant, they're used to being raised above themselves, and based on the schema, we have, Gregorian chant has no harmony, or it is built-in harmony. It's pure melody, more or less. You have free rhythm and no accompanying harmony, so its melody appeals purely to the intellect and the spirit. But if you're used to that, and then you go into music that has a strong harmonic and rhythmic component, then it's going to, I'm going to go back to my convent now, thank you very much. I'm not sure how they would hear it if they could be convinced to listen to it without turning it off in disgust.
How come we don't use the modal system anymore? I'm so sorry.
Well, it's because it's not in tune with post-Reformation.
John, isn't there a movement in the second Brahms symphony which is a modal?
Oh. I don't
The fourth
know.
movement of the second symphony? It doesn't mean anything to me. When
Yes.
I listen, I don't.
Not that I know of, but it very well could be. Why don't we use modes anymore? Because the modes are not as dramatic. They're sort of
That
more
figures.
contemplative.
That figures.
If you listen to a piece of Palestrina, it's not a journey like the sonata form. It's very beautiful, and it's very artistic. So in Palestrina, you have the harmony arises from what's called counterpoint, which is putting one melody against another. So all of the voices, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, have their own melody or their own form of the melody, and the way those parts weave together creates the harmony. But it's a much more, I guess, contemplative would be a good word. It's less active, less dramatic, less passionate.
Figures.
And I think modern listeners and modern composers are not comfortable in that world. So when they do use the modes, it's a special effect, like Beethoven in that string quartet I was talking about, where he's specifically writing prayer to God to thank him for getting over his illness. That is explicitly referring back to the ancient church modes, and he does that at least 2 points, I think, in the Missa Solemnis, his great late setting of the Mass. But an ordinary piece written in the mode, it would be like asking people to listen to Gregorian chant, non-Catholics to listen to Gregorian chant in their spare time. It just wouldn't interest them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I very rudely interrupted you. You was trying to ask a question. I'm so sorry.
Well, I had a probably rhetoric question. In your opinion, why young generation can't listen classic music? I always persuading. I'm
Yeah.
putting, let's say, CD, and they can't cope. They can't cope.
Right.
I'm trying to explain the music is talking about something. They absolutely switching and they go to pop.
Yes.
So to pop music.
Well, they're used to hearing pop. That's what they've. If you hear it on the radio or somebody walking down the street with a boom. Well, I guess people don't do that anymore. They have earbuds. But if you, not that I'm proposing this, but if you take a newborn infant, totally isolate him from modern society, put him on a deserted island with parents and everything, and play him only classical music, he'll probably get it. But pop music is a path of considerably less resistance. It's obvious at first glance what's going on, because you're not doing that whole structure. You're just going. Anybody can. Oh, well, I get what he's doing. Okay, yeah, I'm getting the hang of this. Okay, and then, whoa! He modulated. Oh, it's so artistic. So if the child is grown up listening to that, and also with words about lost my girlfriend, or whatever. You know, that's going to be, it's like, that's obvious and appealing. Whereas if you try to get them to listen to a Beethoven song, it's like,
Pop music is much simpler, which is much easier to listen to.
yeah.
You hear the same
Yes.
sequence again and again and again.
Is the answer that pop music doesn't require effort, but classic music, you have to push yourself, your
Right.
mind,
That's
to
true.
bigger effort.
Yes, pop music, and especially rock, and even more towards the rhythmic end of the scale, away from harmony and melody and towards rhythm. That is sort of appealing to the natural instincts.
Lower instincts.
Yeah, lower instincts,
All right.
exactly. Right,
I
and
understand.
classical music, if you just listen to it in those terms, it's like, well, that doesn't give me anywhere near as much of a drug high as the rock and roll music does. So if they're listening to it in terms of does it give me a drug high, then they're going, no, I don't want to listen to Mozart or Beethoven. And in order to listen to it properly, you have to re-educate your ear, like I was trying to do at great and abstruse length in the talk that I was giving. And most people don't have the patience for that. I mean, you can appreciate the music without knowing any of that, but it's complicated enough that it's difficult to get a handle on it. That's the explanation is sort of a shortcut, if you can understand it. If you just listen to the music over and over again until you get to see how it's put together, fine, but that takes a lot of patience, and that's usually not something that young people have.
The pop music is playing on ritual sin, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's. I mean, the bishop can speak more about that, but it's appealing to the passions. It's appealing to your animal instincts, and that's why, for instance, rock musicians are generally not saints, to put it mildly.
Coriolanus overture
Yeah.
goes to the two passions very clearly in different moments, the irascible and the concupiscible. But at the same time, there's a lot for the mind.
Right.
It's very architectural.
Right, it's structured passion, whereas in the rock music you don't have much structure.
Yes.
You just have whoa, you know, whatever. I don't know.
Beethoven's architectural passion or passionate architecture.
Right.
The mind is very much there. The mind is very much in action.
And that's evidenced by he will, in the middle of a huge storm, he'll often suddenly drop it. It'll just be pianissimo. He has absolute control over what he's doing with the music. And that gives the effect of, it's not just somebody in a passion without any overall control. This is passion that is, it's an experience, a human experience that Beethoven is structuring by putting it into a highly structured and coherent musical form. And so that, like in a play, you don't just have somebody running loose on the stage killing everybody. You work up to it by a story. and so for instance, you don't say, well, Hamlet, everybody dies at the end, so it's the same as a modern slasher movie where it's like, killed you, killed you, killed you. But the point is that the tragedy, because Hamlet had great potential and then he went downhill, so that the final scene where everybody is dead is an outcome of bad, immoral choices that he made, rather than it's just slasher and we want to see lots of blood and guts. So it's a similar thing with the classical music. You have, in the Coriolanus Overture, you have rage and passion depicted very, I mean, that's it. And that is not how Beethoven usually sounds. He's depicting a specific emotion or a specific action in the play. That's the scene where the general is angry and the women are coming to plead with him. But it's not just all over the place. It's not like Stravinsky, where it's whoa, Stravinsky, way to go, dude. You really got some good chords. Well, let's...
In this connection,
Yes.
how about playing before the last thing before lunch? The last page of
Yes.
the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, because you get there amidst the bubble and squeak, you get this sudden pause. Do you remember?
The Fourth Symphony?
Fourth Symphony, last
movement.
Fourth movement.
Yes, right.
The end of the fourth movement. The
Right.
end of the symphony.
And that's very Haydn, actually, to pause like that. So this is one of the lighter Beethoven sonatas, symphonies, sorry. So a symphony is a sonata for orchestra, basically. It's in sonata form, and it has the usual series of fast movement, slow movement, possibly a dance movement, and then a bright finale, but it's for the full orchestra instead of just for one piano. So this is one of the lighter of Beethoven's symphonies, coming in between the Eroica, the third, and the fifth, the dramatic, which is very heavy duty. This is lighter, but lighter because it's Beethoven, so it's not going to be totally...
So you get this moment which suggests the depths underneath
Right, exactly.
the bubble and the squeak.
So the main theme of the last movement is a pretty typical Haydn theme. It might have been Haydn. And then Beethoven works with it. So here's the last page where it sounds like we're doing the grand wrap-up and the symphony is going to end with a bang. Well, what happens here? And the main theme starts very quietly in the basses. So then he does a Haydn trick of slowing the theme down, twice as slow. And he stops in the middle. The bassoon goes, and some string instrument goes. Oh, well that's sad. And then you get your crash bang ending after all, but there's depth. Whereas if you'd just gone fine, but you don't get the glimpse underneath that you do the way he wrote it.
Lunch.